Well, thank you so much, Juan, for being flexible. And thanks everybody for being on this panel. Just some housekeeping instructions. Please feel free to use the chat window. You guys are probably experts at this by now on day 3. And just remember, all of our conference expectations must be listed here for a positive experience and for listening and connecting with people. And then if you need any bilingual interpretation, if you scroll down below this window, there's instructions for that. And at the end of this segment, we'll open up a poll and we'd really appreciate your help. Also, I just got an email from Jackie, so I will work with her to see if I can get her on.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So should we get started?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Welcome to a conversation on becoming Latinx anti-racists in our environmental movement. My name is Juan de Clet Barreto. I'm the Climate Vulnerability Social Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a national scientific advocacy group working at the science and policy interface for a healthy population and a healthy planet. People of color in the environmental movement are indeed one community with many voices, but some voices, especially Black, Indigenous, African American, Afro-Latinx, and other Afro-descendants, have been and continue to be marginalized in our movement. Marginalization of Black and other environmentalist voices of color is wide-ranging, from the failure to equitably address and financially support the health and climate impact needs of environmental justice and other frontline grassroots organizations, to the lack of Black and other people of color in decision-making formal power positions in leadership and boards of national environmental organizations. The pernicious legacies of slavery, racism, colonialism, and imperialism among descendants of or people from Latin America are also present in our Latinx culture and environmental movement. Latinx people of all ethnic and racial backgrounds must show up for Black and other environmentalists of color, especially those who are white passing, white identifying, or whose socioeconomic class or white privilege have shielded them from the pernicious effects of racism and marginalization, must recognize and come to terms with their own colorism and actively work to transform our movement, our organizations, and our work in ways that are explicitly anti-racist. In this panel session, we will discuss, number 1, the ways in which Black, Afro-Latinx, and other voices of color are marginalized or excluded from decision-making processes in the environmental movement. Number 2, discuss how Latinx environmentalists can work together to overcome the legacy of anti-Black racism and colorism. And lastly, discuss how to work together to transform our movement, organizations, and our work in ways that are explicitly anti-racist. To talk about this, we will converse with 3 leaders in the environmental movement, which I have the honor of hosting and moderating the discussion today. First, we will hear from la doctora Adi Martinez Roman, the Senior Policy Analyst Puerto Rico for Oxfam America. Dr. Martinez Roman was the Executive Director of the Fundación Fondo de Acceso a la Justicia in Puerto Rico for 2 years, and the Auxiliary Dean of Students of the University of Puerto Rico Law School, where she also taught several courses on the legal profession, law and poverty, and law and social change. She is currently the president and founder of Firmes Unidos y Resilientes con la Abogacía, or FURIA, Inc., a nonprofit that accompanies low-income community leaders in Puerto Rico on their advocacy endeavors. She holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs, a law degree from the University of Puerto Rico, and received both her master's of law and doctorate of jurisprudence from the Instituto Bartolomé de las Casas of the Universidad Carlos III of Madrid, in Spain. Pedro Cruz is the acting director for the Sierra Club's Healthy Communities campaign. Pedro works with allies in the labor, economic, and racial justice movements to create family-sustaining union jobs in clean infrastructure, especially in low-income and communities of color. Previously, he worked in campaigns ranging from access to renewable energy, equity in public transportation, and immigrant workers' rights. He was a founding member of the Living Wage Action Coalition and was awarded a fellowship by the Kalmanovitz Institute for Working Families at Georgetown University, where he helped to establish a collective of day laborers and developed coordinated a wage theft curriculum. Lastly, we have Jacqueline Patterson, the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Since 2007, Patterson has served as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. Jackie Patterson has worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, advocate, and activist working on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice. Patterson holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. And Ms. Patterson will be joining us shortly. She's having some technical issues that will be resolved. closely. So let's start with the basics. Pedro, can you describe for us some of the ways in which Black, there she is. Hello, Jacqueline. We were just getting started. Pedro, can you describe for us some of the ways in which Black, Afro-Latinx, and other voices of color are marginalized or excluded from decision-making processes in the environmental movement?
Thank you for having me in days, and thank you to everybody for welcoming here. To sum up your question in one word, I would say the invisibility is the big problem. I don't know how the color of our skin give us this superpower that we are invisible and that our voices cannot be heard. That has two dimensions. The invisibility is when environmental organization mostly led by certain demographic that you can define as white, middle class, liberal, college educated, have a difficulty interpreting or working or reaching out to communities of color. A good example of that is in terms of how we are addressing and talking about the problem of climate change. And the problem of climate change, I witnessed myself in more than one occasion that when we're debating how we can avoid climate disaster, what we need to do, there is a set of tools and policy that we should be put in place and advocating for. And that's the main priority. When we do that, many times we ignore that there has been historical environmental justice problem that need to be addressed and that affect mostly communities of color. So many times I've been hearing that when I say, wait a minute, we can do that without consulting with communities of color, say, oh, Pedro, but you don't care about saving the planet, is what I usually hear. And I would say that that's the main problem. Like, we don't recognize that there has been a history of oppression, that there been a history of marginalization, and that there been a history of environmental justice that keep our communities with a different perspective than white-led organization. The other aspect of that is that there is a mistrust from BIPOC communities working with white-led organization. And again, there's historical reasons for that. We don't feel comfortable in those spaces. Sometimes we question ourselves because even if it's a room full of white people, if there's 2 or 3 people of color, it's assumed that that's a diverse space. And it's assuming that those people are representing the whole race. And put us in a situation that we ask ourselves, are we being tokenized by being in this space? And that's a really difficult position. To say something good that is happening right now, that many organizations, especially in the space of the big green, they adopting equity rational. One of them is the GEMES principles. And at least it's a good start because at least we having those conversations of why this is a problem, how should we be reaching out to communities of color. But again, there's always that invisible barrier that there is a policy agenda that we need to advance, and therefore we cannot waste time talking or addressing the needs of community of color, not realizing that you were never going to win if you don't bring all the people affected by the problem together.
Thank you very much for that, Pedro. I realize that there is a lot more to say about that, but we have limited time. So we'll move on to Jackie. Jackie, can you discuss how environmentalists can work together to overcome the legacy of anti-Black racism and colorism?
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all. So yeah, there is a lot that we've seen in our movement, within our movement and with white environmental organizations and so forth. And so there's a lot to unpack there, to be sure. I think the first thing is to actually face and acknowledge it. And I think that there's a quote from James Baldwin that not everything that is faced can be be addressed, but nothing can be addressed if it's not faced. That was a botching of the quote, but that's first and foremost. I was with a group that considered itself to be a pretty liberal, faith-based environmental group. That and the BIPOC folks in the group said we need to have anti-oppression training as a group, because we just saw all the different ways of microaggressions and subtle biases and so forth. And the group, and you could tell that the group was, especially as persons of faith, they thought, wait, there's no way that we could be racist within this group. And so they pushed back, and then they eventually said, okay, we'll do it, but they only wanted to do a half a day. And so really just acknowledging and being ready to do that self-transformational work is important, to be sure. Secondly, we need to recognize the ways that the system is often set up to pit us against each other as BIPOC persons, and we see how that happens in subtle and overt ways, and we need to recognize when that's happening and call it out and be very clear about that. Thirdly, we need to think about our own internalized oppression and the way that we're experiencing anti-Black racism and colorism, even within the BIPOC groups, and work towards healing justice, restorative justice, really engaging in those processes. So again, we face it and we go through the processes to begin, self-transformation and movement transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Ali, you have written quite a bit about building processes of self-determination and empowerment to break the yoke of racism and racist power structures in organizations and governance. Can you discuss how we can work together to transform our movement, our organizations, and our work in ways that are explicitly anti-racist?
Thank you, Juan. I come from the perspective of a colony. Puerto Rico being a colony of the United States for so long, and before that, a colony of Spain. And for me, systematic racism is a part of that white patriarchal infrastructure that is the base of colorism. This is a practice akin to fascism, and that has been established by these roots of white male determinism that goes much to what Pedro was referring to about how the climate movement has been designed by, who designed, right, our movements. So we have to work to dismantle this infrastructure of oppressive racism within our movement. And the only way to do that is by building mechanisms of self-determination within the movement. When I mean mechanisms of self-determination, I mean mechanisms that permit within the movement the constant participation of those who traditionally or historically have been excluded from the decision-making process. So it is part of how do we work, how do we train anti-oppression, where part of the way of training on anti-oppression is practicing decision-making and designing the procedures that are going to guarantee the participation of those that are traditionally excluded. And this is not an easy task. We're talking about a change of culture. We have to promote the true dialogue for common understanding of the peoples involved. We have to admit what and be able to name what is happening, right? But also to forgive and to identify those pathways to heal, because that mistrust, this thing about tokenizing others, there has to be this process of healing and forgiving. Then we have to implement deliberation strategies that are more inclusive and democratic within our movement, implementing techniques that attend to those that are most vulnerable first as a priority, and implementing ways that those that are traditionally excluded, and it's not going to be a definite solution that will solve, like an ideal method that will solve this all the time, but we have to keep that in mind. If we don't have the ideal, we won't be able to have a mechanism that will be perfect. So we have to attend to those that are excluded, even from those mechanisms that we create. Is having a persistent consciousness that exclusion will happen as we collectively construct these new mechanisms and these new meanings. I take all this and all this has to be done with humbleness. I take all this from the theory of liberation in Latin America and processes in Puerto Rico where we have struggled to give power to impoverished communities and to community leaders that have been traditionally excluded of processes. And through the organizations that I founded and through Oxfam, we have been trying to implement and promote the creation of those mechanisms where these people have direct voice in the decision-making process, in the creation of the recovery example, the disaster recovery plans, and in the oversight of the use of federal funds for disaster recovery. It's a work that requires a lot of nimbleness, but at the same time, a very clear moral compass. The consciousness that we are here to be truly deliberative, through dialogue of what is going to be the new reality that is defined by the collective in a real self-determinative, collective self-determination process.
Thank you very much, Hattie. I think it's obvious that there is a good body of academic work based on justice and based on the liberation ideologies and so on that has been connected very well then to underground, to the concrete, right? To how do we create these transformations. Now, I have another question, more general for everybody. Maybe Pedro can take a stab at it, or Jackie. Those who fear emerging political power of Black people and other people of color fear that all that we want is to flip the table and oppress the oppressors, which is, of course, not what this is about. I mean, it's a typical psychological response from an oppressor, right? How do we move towards that idea of restorative justice? How does that work in practice? I'd like to understand that a little bit more. You want to take that, Jackie? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't see you. My bad.
Sorry, Jackie.
Oh no, I think no. You should go if you're ready. I need to pick it through. I think. Do you mind going first, Pedro?
Ready.
What did you say,
Jackie?
Question, Juan, because I froze and I was
I'm
not
sorry.
able to
I'll repeat
hear.
it quickly. How do we move towards restorative justice? That's kind of what I like to understand. Maybe Jackie?
Okay, sure. Yes. So yeah, I think that one key piece is recognizing the as Adi was saying, and as Pedro was alluding as well, is recognizing that that we are bound, we're bound together by this kind of collective quest for liberation. And so in order for us to, and that our core needs are similar, and that our what we need to push back against is this narrative around scarcity. And so as we recognize in the narrative around scarcity and the push for wealth and power, combined with the push for wealth and power for a handful of people, has combined to exact this institutionalized systematic oppression. And if we really begin to shift the narrative around abundance and recognizing that I can't, it's not necessary for you to be disadvantaged in order for me to be advantaged, and to recognize that the only way that we can all succeed is if we all work together, is I think is a key foundation. And definitely as thinking about the ways that that the way this country was built was on the disadvantage and the dehumanization of certain peoples, and that we need to be thinking about how do we right size those systems of oppression that have left certain people in a situation where this notion of Black Lives Matter, which is in some ways a pretty low bar in terms of what, but that's where we stand when we have people being brought down in the streets like George Floyd. So that's all to say, recognizing that there are really a handful of folks who are trying to push this scarcity narrative, recognizing that there is abundance, recognizing that if we all work together, we can all succeed, and putting the processes in place to as Adi was saying, to advance self-determination, whether it is looking at policies around reparations, looking at how those get actually institutionalized, looking at ways that we can put together systems like shifting our energy system from a system where it is about amassing wealth for a wealthy few and shutting off electricity for someone who isn't able to pay a $60 bill and therefore jeopardizing their life. So looking at each and every one of our systems, looking at our food systems and the ways that we can actually recognize that the earth was designed to replenish and to provide food constantly. Why is it that we have 26% of African Americans who are food insecure? So really breaking down each and every one of these systems, thinking about ways to repair those systems so that they provide for all, and thinking about ways that we can all make sure that we have this notion of collectivization versus individualism. So. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that. I think there has been a lot of interest in the chat about the things that Ali mentioned. I think there people want to hear, what I can collate from the different questions is people want to see some concrete examples of how the mechanisms that you talked about work in practice. So Ali, can you please give us some more detail on that?
Yes, I can talk from the experience that we have had here in Puerto Rico with impoverished communities, the leaders of those communities. There was a law approved in 2001 in Puerto Rico. It's called Special Communities Law. This law was very vanguardist because it gave the right, it literally says that the residents of those communities are the protagonists of their reality, and they have the right to participate in the decision-making process of things that affect them. I was a law student at a time working with community leaders in Puerto Rico. And as we saw that the government did not implement that law because it was so powerful, we started promoting a community, a movement of community leaders within Puerto Rico, where we would include them or integrate them in assemblies. And we would do community leaders assemblies where we will discuss what are their priorities of the things that have to be done in their communities and what would they can work together to move forward and what advocacy strategies we could do. And all those processes would be done in a participatory way. We would create committees, right? And these committees then will propose, I don't know, like the amendment of a law. And we would create a draft of that amendment. And we would go back to the group and discuss line by line what we were proposing. And the group would say, oh, that will work. Oh, that would not work. Oh, blah, blah, blah. So in that way, we got, for example, a proposed amendment to the eminent domain law in Puerto Rico, which reflects the wisdom of the community leaders that say, for example, this is a very, not trivial, but it's comic. The eminent domain law says that you are notified about eminent domain with a letter or a small sign in the house, right? And the community leaders were like, no, that does not work. We need to have cruzacalles.
Banners.
I don't know how you
like
say that in English.
Banner?
A big banner in the entrance of the community. We have to have altoparlantes, like going around telling people that this is happening, because if not, they will not know that this is happening. So we integrated that into the law. So this creation of assemblies, committees, this retroalimentation from the professionals that are doing the draft of the law to the people that are actually affected by it. And this retroalimentation, this constant dialogue produces something more powerful, produces something that actually will work and that actually they will stand behind of. So these community leaders have gone with us to the legislature to legislate that because they really believe in it, because they were part of producing it. And that's the type of things that we're trying to create. And that's why working with Oxfam now, I have been promoting advocacy in the federal level that integrates local voices into the disaster recovery process, because they're always saying how, oh, the Puerto Rican government is corrupt, the Puerto Rican government is corrupt, the Puerto Rican government is a colonial government. So you have to dismantle that and give the power of oversight to the people that are actually on the ground doing the recovery process. So we propose a civil society task force that is composed by leaders of the different sectors of civil society to be authorized to make decisions and promote actions regarding the use of federal recovery funds. That is really, people are like, oh my God, that is so out there. But we are very confident that that is the only way to really break through that infrastructure of control and hegemony that is excluding the most oppressed from the decision-making process and the results of that decision making.
Thank you very much, Ari. So it's really obvious, right, that self-emancipation and the participation of communities in the design, not just as clients of political systems, like it happens in colonial systems like Puerto Rico, and in the political system also here in the U.S. and in most so-called democracies. We only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to mention quickly that the scarcity mentality that Jackie was talking about, I think that's caught up in very many sorts of pseudoscientific type of ideas about, for example, that lead to, for example, the idea of population control, and that they are what has ecologically passed for the fundamental limits of the carrying capacity of the earth, and has been used as arguments to keep resources and developmental goals from being achieved by people of color. Which is, it's a completely different conversation. But I wanted to give Pedro a chance to maybe say something that he didn't get a chance to say, or maybe share some anecdotes or something like that in a minute or so.
Just basically that reminder that communities of color are people speaking on behalf of communities of color. They are not a monolith. Or we are not a monolith. Like, don't assume that because we have a couple of us in the room, like everybody's in the room, we have diversities or ideas. That many times that's not taken into consideration or calculation. Also, addressing what you were mentioning before, like how we can start this restorative process. That's a very important conversation to have. Unfortunately, in the United States, we are not at that point yet. I think we are extremely divided society right now, and there should be a healing process before we get there. Because otherwise we're going to be repeating what happened in other parts of the world where they had that kind of restorative process, where people who were affected the most, where people were victimized the most, were the people who were saying, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Pedro. I hate to cut people off, but we have 1 minute, and I'm not sure that we're not going to get cut off by the platform in 30 seconds. So I want to close out and say thank you to the panelists and the audience for joining us today. I realize that. Are we cut off?
You're not cut.
Okay, no, sorry. I realize 30 minutes. Sorry, I realize 30 minutes is a very short amount of time to discuss the encompassing and deeply rooted issue of racism in our movement. I hope we've contributed to deepening the conversation as we search for anti-racist solutions in our work. And I'll try to provide answers to some of the questions that were left over in the chat and circulate them back to the audience by email or through some other way. I'd like to thank Serenela, Eliza, Denise, Renee, and the rest of the Naturally Latino conference organizers for giving us the space to share with you all today. Have a great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Juan, and all the panelists. And we want to thank our sponsors. And please remember to head over and take the poll before you head out. Thanks, everybody, so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.